Uh, Welcome, everyone. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's session of our spring series. It's actually starting to feel a little bit like spring around here in New York anyway. Our series, as you know, is The Power of Emotion, Judaism, and the Inner Life. So welcome to everyone returning, and special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today. We're so pleased to have Professor Alan Cooper teaching us today on the metaphor of the burning heart from the Book of Jeremiah to the Metropolitan Opera. You can always count on Dr. Cooper to come up with intriguing titles. Really looking forward to this session on, as you put it, Professor Cooper, irresistible, passion constrained. So thank you for teaching us today, and Tani will introduce you a little at greater length later. I also want to thank so much JTS trustee Yael Asbel for sponsoring today's session at the Navi level, $1,800 level. Thank you so much, Yael, for being an amazing supporter and participant in our community learning programs. We invite everyone who feels inspired by this learning with JTS scholars to consider sponsoring a session. We have 3 levels at 540, 1,000, and 1,800. And there's information in the chat on that. You can email learninglives@jtsa.edu. And now I will turn it over to Tani for a few more announcements.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to go over the Q&A for today's session, Dr. Cooper will pause periodically throughout the session for Q&A. Again, at the end of the session, you can chat your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. She will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Cooper. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link this morning, and we'll also be screen sharing them during the session. So pleased to introduce Dr. Cooper. Dr. Alan Cooper is the Elaine Ravitch Professor of Jewish Studies. Dr. Cooper earned his doctorate in religious studies from Yale University, focusing on the linguistic structure of biblical poetry. Dr. Cooper's publications include many articles on biblical poetics and the history of interpretation. He is currently working on a commentary on a selection of Psalms for the Jewish Publication Society. And Dr. Cooper has taught several times as part of the series. We're so pleased to have him teaching for us again today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Cooper.
We don't hear you, Dr. Cooper.
Perhaps it's a problem with your headset. I don't know if you want it, because I see that you're unmuted.
That I use this new high-tech headset because it's worked so well in the past. Actually, it has. But as long as you can hear me using my standard computer microphone, I'm happy. And I'll give you an extra 3 minutes at the end. That's okay with Rabbi Andelman and Tani. Anyway, I'll begin, first of all, by once again thanking Rabbi Andelman, this time audibly, and then also Tani for all their hard work in putting this program together and for their great technical assistance as well. And my friend Yael Asbel, who unfortunately can't be with us today because he has another all-day meeting. I told him he'd be better off with us, but he seemed not to agree. I want to thank him for his continuing support for me personally, and also for the wonderful programs of our community engagement department. Now I'd like to begin with a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. To take time off to be able to learn Torah with you is an incredible privilege, and especially when we consider what's going on in the world right now, which offers a tremendous opportunity for diversion. It's really useful to be able to have the balm of Torah study to fall back on in times of crisis. So with that said, I'm going to guess that most of you heard about one of the major cultural events in New York in the fall, when the Metropolitan Opera began to resume live productions. And that was the history-making premiere of the first opera composed by a Black American at the Metropolitan Opera, which was Terence Blanchard's Fire Shut Up in My Bones. I'm sure this learned audience immediately recognized the title of the opera as being a quotation from the book of Jeremiah. So that set my mind wondering about the significance of the quotation for the opera and for its source, which was the memoir of an excellent and well-regarded New York Times columnist named Charles Blow. So from Charles Blow to Terence Blanchard, the memoir of a prominent a Black figure on the cultural scene, to an opera at the Metropolitan Opera using a verse or part of a verse from the book of Jeremiah that eventually interested me. So I wanted to see, number one, how they were making use of the verse. And there's a bit of disappointment there, but we'll get to that. But more interestingly, to me at least, how our Jewish tradition has invested all kinds of interesting significance in the verse and in the narrative that in which the verse is embedded. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to start off by sharing a little screen to talk first, before I talk about the opera at all, to set the scene by talking about these verses in context, and to talk about the two images that are prominent in the verses in Jeremiah, one being the burning heart, Lev Boer, which we'll talk about in detail in a moment, which takes us to the heart of the topic of this Monday series, namely the emotions, the feelings, and how they're expressed in language and literature. And in this case, we'll be talking a lot about metaphor. And I want to emphasize the incredible significance of imagery surrounding the word heart in Jewish literature, the quintessence of which is captured in a passage in the Zohar, which is here quoted by one of the greatest figures in the transition from medieval to modern Judaism, a real fountainhead of modern Orthodox Judaism, Isaiah Horowitz, in his magnum opus compiled by his son, Shnei Luchot Habrit. You see Shin, Lamed, Hey, and so Horowitz is generally known as the Shlah or the Shlah for the acronym of his most famous work. And he has a compendium alphabetically arranged of basic Jewish religious teachings, one of which is under the lemma Lev Tov, a good heart, or many would translate that a pure heart, as we'll see. And he begins that lemma with a citation from Psalm 51, one of the most well-known, most prominent penitential psalms, one that's even more central to Christian liturgy than it is to Jewish liturgy, although of course we use it too. And it goes, Lev tahor barali Elohim beruach nachon chadesh b'kirbi. So a pure heart create for me, God, and a steadfast spirit renew within me. But renew is actually a bit inaccurate. It should be create anew within me. So a new spirit, which would be consistent with the way the prophets think about the heart. But that's then leads to the Shloah quoting this fabulous passage from the Zohar, which shows us how the heart is used metaphorically and typologically, by which I mean that there's a kind of macrocosm and microcosm, and there are many things in the world and in ourselves that are referred to by the use of the word heart. So his words, the Shlah, the heart is the source of life, Makor Chaim, placed in the center of the body, corresponding to the Holy of Holies, which is the center point of the world. So you can see that we're talking about the place where God's presence, the presence of God, is made most readily manifest in biblical and in modern metaphorical thinking about the tabernacle and about the temple and about the world in general. So you have the macrocosm, which is the world, which God's presence at the center of the world. Then you have the tabernacle as the center of the center, and the Holy of Holies, which is the center of the center of the center, as it were. And then, of course, we have another way of thinking about the heart, which is in connection with our bodies. And our bodies are temples, tabernacles, little worlds as well, with the heart at the center. So you can see why heart imagery is so prominent in Jewish thought. Here's a little bit of the typological thinking that you can see straight out of the Zohar. The Blessed Holy One, this translation is from the wonderful multi-volume translation of Daniel Matt. I didn't think you'd want me to read the Aramaic either, so we'll stick with the English. He designed him according to the supernal precious pattern. In other words, it's a kind of Platonic pattern of this ideal with the heart at the center that's manifest in these different levels, as I've already mentioned. Placed the strength and power in the middle of the body where the heart dwells, which is the potency and nourishment of the whole body. From there, the whole body is sustained and all the members of the body are fed. And the heart is connected to a supernal place above, the brain and the head, dwelling above. One is linked with the other. In a similar way, the Blessed Holy One arranged the world. And then in this incredible tour de force, the Zohar will go on to talk about how the arrangement of the natural world corresponds to the same pattern, which Daniel Matt translates as the supernal precious pattern. So once again, emphasizing the incredible significance of the heart within us, both as our natural source of life and also as a metaphorical one. And in case you doubt any of this as being quintessentially Jewish and mystical, I could refer you to some earlier Jewish mystical traditions that are based more in the area of numerology. So here's an esoteric Jewish teaching that's very familiar from early mystical texts, but that you may not be familiar with. Why do we wear a tzitzit? Why do we wear tzitzis that has 32 strands? Well, the 32 strands of the tzitzis correspond numerically 32, lev, bet, 30 plus 2, 32 to the heart. So the 32 strands of the tzitzis, when you wrap them around your finger, are actually a pathway to the heart. What's the heart? Well, you can hold the tzitzit over your heart, right? Over your heart when you pray, or you can say that this is the actual connection from your little heart in your body to the supreme heart, which is, of course, the heart in the middle of the Holy of Holies, the divine presence. And just to emphasize that point a little further, our mystical traditions note that the word that is used to designate the glory of God that we experience in the world is the word kavod, glory. And wouldn't you know, the word kavod has the numerical value of 32, which is the same as the numerical value of heart, and which then corresponds to the center of the center of the center, where all nourishment, physical and spiritual, comes from. Another tour de force, I'll stop sharing this for just a moment.
Professor Cooper, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We can hear you, but it's not great.
Folks, ready? Do you remember the time, some of you probably were in the class that I taught that my old computer conked out of. All right. Now I erase the volume. Okay, say something, please, so that I can see if I can hear you.
Okay. Now we do not hear you. Did you go into preferences and audio and make sure the right mic is selected?
I'm just gonna say something that my
old friend, the former head of the Hebrew Union College Library, was fond of saying about technology. He used to say, you should always be surprised when it works. All right. So let me just put this other screen on for a moment. And I hope you're here. Are you hearing more clearly now?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. This comes from the Midrash Rabbah on the Book of Ecclesiastes. And unfortunately, I don't have a translation readily available, but I really just wanted to show it to you very briefly. And you can see it's a clear vocalized text. And it's on the verse, chapter 1, verse 16, in which Solomon begins speaking by saying, Dibarti ani im libi, which is a very strange expression if you, unless you want to take it in some sort of metaphorical way. And this launches the author of the Midrash into a regular paroxysm of metaphorical uses of the imagery of the heart. So he says, well, this means the heart sees a great deal. Libira aharbe. And now you can just look down where they have all the different proof texts. Halev shomea. The heart listens, as it says, and then we get a proof text from Kings. The heart speaks, as this verse says that we just looked at. The heart walks, as it says. Lo libi halach. The heart falls, and so forth. The heart stands, the heart rejoices. That's enough of that. But I wanted you to see this extraordinary list of different metaphorical uses to which the image of the heart is put according to our Midrash. And if you look at the footnote at the bottom of my first page of this screen, you'll see that just to go, the Midrash one better, the great Jacob Emden, the Avetz, in his commentary on the Sidur, quotes the Midrash, which has 58 metaphorical uses of heart, of which Jeremiah 29, our verse, is number 38, and then he adds 65 more of his own. So you could spend a lot of time pondering the metaphors that are connected with this idea. Okay, now, without further ado, I'd like to come to the verse itself. Jeremiah has just suffered mightily at the hands of Pashur, the son of one of the priests, who has had Jeremiah imprisoned, beaten him up, and then this is Jeremiah's response when he finally gets out of his imprisonment. Pititani Adonai va'epat, chazaktani va'tuchal. I've parsed this as poetry because it is rather rhythmical. This is my translation. You seduced me, Adonai, and I was seduced. You overpowered me and you prevailed. I've become a constant laughingstock. Everyone derides me. Every time I speak, ki midei adaber ezak chamas, vashod ekra. Beautiful little couplet with the verbs in symmetrical order. I shout violence, terror, I cry out. And we're going to talk in a moment about what that means. Why? Ki haya devar Adonai li lecherpa ulekeles kol hayom. The word of Adonai has become with me a source of continual shame and derision. So I thought, I'm not going to mention God. I'm not going to speak anymore in God's name. And think about this. The torment of the prophet called to deliver God's word, who is suffering nothing but getting beaten up and getting imprisoned and getting treated with derision by the people to whom he's prophesying. But then it's the moment that he says that he's not going to speak anymore in God's name. Lo adaber od bishmo. He says, V'haya b'libi ke'esh po'eret. And there's our core imagery. It was in my fire. It is like a fire. It has become like a fire, shut up in my bones. Atzur ba'atzmotai. I'm too weak to endure it. I cannot. That's incredible, the way the little passage ends just with the negative. I cannot. Eiti chalkel velo uchal. I cannot, which of course matches up against what he said about God, vatuchal. You can. You prevailed is the way it's translated here, because that makes sense in the context, but it just wraps up the symmetry of the little piece. Rashi is going to elaborate on it by glossing it with some additional words that clarify. So you seduced me to go on your mission. And if you recall the beginning of the book of Jeremiah, you know that Jeremiah is one of those reluctant prophets who has to be called upon to submit to God's will, just like Moses at the beginning of his story. You made your strong hand heavy upon me to go against my will. That's pretty audacious for Rashi to be adding that. I didn't want to go. You made me go. You overpowered me. It's not because God made Jeremiah particularly strong or able to bear up under the pressure. God knew that God had the appropriate vessel to carry forth the divine message. And God simply beat Jeremiah down. Everybody mocks God. Every time I speak to them, I must shout and raise my voice. I do not proclaim good for them, but prophecies of violence and terror. So what's he saying here? That what makes his mission so hateful to him is that he can never deliver any prophecies except prophecies that promise to bring down judgment, violence, and terror upon his people. Well, no wonder he doesn't get a welcome with them, right? And that's why they put me to shame. They're ashamed to me of me for what I said. But if I don't mention God, if my heart said to me not to go on your mission anymore, the prophecy would be like in my heart, like a raging fire against my will. I must go. Have you ever felt that experience yourselves, to have something burning within you, whether it's a bad memory or a secret or something that you have to cry out about but can't cry out about, or something that if you do divulge, it's going to cause you nothing but anxiety and torment and possibly suffering at the hands of people who don't want to hear what you have to say? That's real life. I love this artistic representation, which is not necessarily one of Jeremiah, but there's an interesting website that seeks to provide biblical interpretations of artistic images. And since late Goya is something I really quite love, I also enjoyed this effort on the part of a theologian, a British theologian, to connect the suffering posture of this individual who's fleeing from a fire with Jeremiah. And I love this question. Is he escaping or raising the alarm? And then he he associates that directly with Jeremiah. Jeremiah seeks to do the former and certainly does the latter, right? The former being to run away. But in the end, he capitulates to God, and he has to take this thing that's burning him up from inside, literally, and get it out, which is only going to lead to more suffering on his part. The word consumes Jeremiah. He has a light with it. We talk of someone being on fire when they're consumed with passion for something, but that's not necessarily a good thing, as in Jeremiah's case. He suffers with the word that he's commissioned to deliver, and then he suffers once again for having the audacity to deliver it, these oracles of judgment. So I quite like that. Whenever you talk about the prophetic mission in Jewish tradition, you always have to refer back to Maimonides. I think I have the reference wrong, but it doesn't matter because you can just look it up at the link that I've provided. And I'm not giving you the Arabic original, but rather here you have the Hebrew translation of Samuel ibn Tibbon and a turn of the 20th century English translation by Friedlander, which is of the Arabic and remains of excellent quality. And as opposed to more modern translations, it's also available freely to you on the web. So he's going to talk about this urgency that the prophet feels, not just to attain illumination as a result of some communication from God, but to convey that illumination, that communication to other people at considerable cost to himself. It is the nature of this element in man that he who possesses an additional degree of that influence, that's the influence, that the flux that comes from God, is compelled to address his fellow men under all circumstances, whether he's listened to or not, even if he injures himself thereby. So you can see how Rambam is thinking immediately of Jeremiah. When Jeremiah was despised, like other teachers and scholars of his age, he could not, though he desired it, withhold his prophecy or cease from reminding the people of the truths which they rejected. This is remarkably powerful, to my way of thinking, in a description of the conflict, the internal conflict that the prophet who is commissioned to deliver the oracle of judgment must experience. And you can see how the burning fire that's shut up in my bones would be an appropriate metaphorical way of talking about this. So then he quotes Jeremiah because Jeremiah is this exemplar. And this is also the meaning of the words of another prophet, namely Amos: the Lord God hath spoken, who shall not prophesy? The compulsion of the word that forces the prophet to speak. When we come to Isaac Abarbanel, and after I look at Abarbanel, I'll stop for your questions and comments. We have a difference of opinion about the meaning of these words, violence and terror, as Jeremiah expresses them. You remember Rashi says that violence and terror characterize the words that Jeremiah has been commissioned to convey to the people. So he's preaching violence and terror and judgment to them, and naturally they're furious with him. So they're going to imprison him and beat him up and mistreat him and treat him with derision. So he understands it differently. It is preferable, he says, yoter nachon lefaresh ki midei adaber bechol eit she'adaber aleihem devar nevuah etzarech litzok chamas fashod me'abizyonot v'amakot sheyasu li. In other words, what he's doing is he's complaining about the violence and terror that he is experiencing on account of being compelled to convey these words of judgment. So he becomes a kind of a Jobin figure in the way he presents himself in these verses in Jeremiah in Abarbanel's interpretation. Because of my prophesying in the name of Adonai, as God commanded me to do, he beat me and imprisoned me, and I had to cry out violence and terror for what he did to me. So this is the prophet's complaint. The prophet's calling out for some compassion from God that is not forthcoming, because what God wants Jeremiah to do is to carry out his mission. To the point that many times I said in my heart, I will not mention God. No more will I speak in God's name. It's just beautiful the way he weaves this narrative out of the biblical verse and fleshes it out with meaning that you can, I think, easily empathize with. The idea that in speaking truth, you incur suffering as a result. In calling people out and telling them what they don't want to hear, that they commit acts of violence against you. When the word of Adonai is the spirit of prophecy that comes upon me, it's like a raging fire in my heart, an unendurable burden to withhold words. That's so fantastic. So once again, I refer to the thing that's burning you up inside. On the one hand, you're fearful of expressing it. On the other hand, you have to get it out. You just have to. You have to tell someone. He said this, Marze, l'chozek ha'hitpa'alut ha'gadol, sheyitpa'el ruach hanavi b'kabalo ruach nevuyi. The powerful fervor that excites the spirit of the prophet when he receives the prophetic spirit. I'll stop now for questions and comments with your permission.
You just put so much out there. I wanted to just see if we can. I'm just pretending that I'm in your classroom and there aren't 247 people here. If I can do that for a moment, I just want to recap to make sure we sort of got the major points that you just said, because especially because we had the audio issues at the beginning. I think what you're saying is this is not what you're going through in the sources is not at all what I, think of instinctively if someone says burning heart or raging fire. We're talking about something that's planted by God, something that's sort of trapped inside, like it's a prophecy that either sort of hits someone who is unable to communicate it, or situation prevents them from communicating it. So it's sort of unendurable to keep inside. It's something that in the painting or the drawing, right, it's consuming rather than inspiring. Am I hitting sort of the key points of how the various texts are getting at this, trying to flesh out this term?
Well, I loved that consuming but not inspiring. That's a great way to put it. That it's burning you up, but not for good. It's not good. We're going to see this later in the Hasidic material that we'll look at. That it's not good. It's burning you up, and you're caught between the rock and the hard place, because if you don't get it out, it will continue burning you up. If you do, then you're putting yourself at extraordinary risk, because you're going to be saying something that people don't want to hear. And I don't think that it pertains exclusively to prophecy. I mean, I would ask everybody in the virtual room to think about something, a secret they've been told, something that happened in their lives that they know they should tell somebody, but they can't tell someone. And it's not an oxymoron to say that the two things occur simultaneously. I mean, I was thinking before, as I was getting ready for this class, about things that I feel that way about. And I came up with at least two. One was about 50 years ago, and one was about 60 years ago, I'm happy to say. But they still come up in my heart. They still come up in my mind. Did I do the right thing? Should I have told someone? And it just doesn't go away. And then, of course, there are people who are exactly the opposite. They love to be contrary, and they love to be gadflies, and they like to, as we used to say back in my adolescent era, let it all hang out. Right? That's not a very good tactic either. And Jeremiah is not a let it all hang out guy, because the way he feels under compulsion. And so that's really, thank you for that summary. That was terrific.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to questions from our friends here. So a couple people asked about, is it the case that the heart in biblical texts and in Jewish tradition in general is the site of, is it the locus of emotion, intellect, both? How is the heart being used here?
It depends on who's doing the using, but the general biblical notion of heart is that the heart is the seat of the intellect, and the guts are the seat of the emotions. So when the lady in Song of Songs says, Al Kain Hamu Me'ilo, which means my guts were in an uproar for him, that's because it's the site of physical passion. But back to what Rabbi Andelman said in summarizing the first part of the presentation, what I want to get away from is just the notion that we're dealing with imagery that generically has to do with passion, but that there's a more specific kind of tormenting passion that is referred to in the Jeremiah, and also, as we'll see, in the memoir and in the op. And finally, we'll see this flipped 180 degrees on its head by the Hasidic tradition. I'll anticipate what I'm going to say about that, just so you'll have something to look forward to, which is that in Jeremiah, the idea is to get this fire out, because otherwise it's going to consume you from within. in Hasidic writing, and particularly in the teachings of Nachman of Brazlov, it's exactly the opposite. The idea is to get imbued with the fire, to have the passion infuse your being with love of God and love of Torah. So instead of getting this potentially destructive force out of your body, you want to get it into your body so that you can become one with the source of the fire. That's a splendid 180-degree reversal of Jeremiah's complaint in context. And we'll see how this works and how adroitly the Hasidic sources use the imagery of the Jeremiah verse.
So on the point you made just before you went to the Hasidic sources about kind of these terms of torment. So someone asked, I'll just read what the person wrote. Can Dr. Cooper comment on the verbs used in the beginning being verbs in the Bible that are used when a woman is violated?
Wait, which, I can't share my screen, so I'm not exactly sure which verbs we're talking about there.
I'm not sure either. Actually, that's why I read it. I thought maybe you would know right away. Well,
maybe let's hold
sound...
that in abeyance.
Yeah, okay. So, but it
because
sounds
I'm going to be talking about sex in a moment.
Yeah. Okay, good. So let's hold that. Okay, and then there were a couple questions about, well, actually a lot of people are sharing the things that are burning them up that you would sort of referred obliquely to these things decades ago that you carried, and people are relating to that. I just wanted to share. Okay, there's so many different kinds of comments here. Maybe for now we'll just do this one. Someone asked if there's a connection metaphorically to the burning bush that isn't consumed.
Oh, that could make a great midrash, couldn't it? To connect the various images associated with burning, the revelatory presence of God as discerned by Moses there, which functions in a way to transform Moses's personality. It's part of the essential transformation of Moses from Egyptian to Israelite, that he has that encounter. And obviously the commission of Jeremiah is completely transformative of his personality and his sense of mission. So, that's just off the top of my head. And it could be that there are other possibilities for linking these different images of burning that you should think about. Thanks.
There's
So
also right, we don't we say that it says somewhere that I'm blanking on now, right, that God is the Eshochla, or a devouring fire.
Yes, the fire and water are two of the most powerful and important biblical images because of obviously their oppositeness, because either one can be an incredibly powerful source of life and nurture, and either one can be a source of terrible destruction. So theophanic manifestations, God's manifestations in the natural world, often are represented literally in terms of the images of water and fire. That's an excellent observation. Then you have to wonder, is this the benign one or is this the destructive one? Shall we return
Yes.
to the text?
Yes,
Okay.
go ahead.
So I can share my screen again. Here we go.
Yes, you should be able to.
Thanks. Okay, so now we've got to come to Charles Blow. And as I said, I was a little disappointed after having seen the title, Fire Shut Up in My Bones, a memoir, to see so little reference to the verse and its language during the course of the book itself. It turns out, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, that the fire that he has shut up in his bones is the memory of sexual abuse that he suffered at the hand of a cousin who spent some time with him in his home that he didn't tell anybody about, but had a terrible effect on his personality. And in the opera, in the beginning of the opera, he experiences that abuse. And in the end of the opera, he experiences some kind of a moment of self-revelation and clearing away of that burning fire by confiding in his mother, which he had not done all his life. So he had this thing burning inside him that he finally is able to exorcise by sharing it with someone, which he had been afraid to do all along. It's very powerful. And the opera itself is fascinating. It's a very interesting, eclectic opera that has a lot of conventional Italian style operatic stuff in it. But then Terence Blanchard, who's a very distinguished jazz musician, will pull out the stops and throw in some American vernacular. And that's when, to me at least, the opera really catches fire, to use that metaphor once again. So here's a little bit where part of the imagery of Jeremiah is used that has absolutely nothing to do with what we've discussed so far. And it has to do with an incident that happens after he has suffered this abuse at the hands of his cousin, when he has a brief affair with a girl whose name is Evelyn. And I've just summarized the plot here. I love what he says about boys. Boys hijacked by hormones don't really think, they chase. Been there, done that. They see risk and consequences as if through the wrong end of a telescope, smaller and pushed far away. So eventually, Charles spends time with Evelyn. They have unprotected sex. And this is the little image that I wanted to call your attention to. My body entered hers and my senses caught fire. So there's the common use of a fire as a metaphor for sexual passion. And what happens eventually during the course of the memoir is that Evelyn declares that she's pregnant. She gives birth to a girl, but eventually it turns out that the father of the child was her previous boyfriend and not Charles. That detail needn't deter us, because the reason I brought up the idea associating with the fire in my bones as sexual passion is because we find that prominently in our sources as well. In this great medieval manual from the 12th to 13th centuries of the German pietists, we find this extraordinary statement. This link will take you to a Princeton University sponsored project to try to make sense out of the chaos of Sefer Hasidim, the Book of the Pious, and finally to come up with a definitive text of the book, which we don't have. 3 impulses, Yitzarim, oppress man, lochatzim et ha'adam al devar ha'isha, on account of woman. Obviously, we're talking about sexual desire that diverts you from what you're supposed to be doing, which of course is contemplating God and studying Torah. And he draws, the author of Sefer Hasidim, on imagery that comes from the book of Hosea. They commit adultery like an oven fired by a baker. So you see the linkage of adultery with fire. With their hearts like an oven, it flares up like a blazing fire. They all get heated like an oven. So Hosea sees the sexualization of Israelite cultic practice, religious practice, metaphorically, in light of this imagery of the blazing fire, and then links the 3 occurrences of the burning oven in the Hosea passage to the 3 impulses, Shlosha Yitzarim al Ha'isha, Lir'ot v'leira'ot. And look at this. Oh, if you have any Hebrew, you'll know this is untranslatable. Yetzer hirhur shel ta'ava v'chimud shel chimum. That's just a whole cluster of words referring to the being heated up with sexual passion, desire, impulsive yearning, and passion, which is unquenchable. So you can see the incredible transformation of Jeremiah's imagery into imagery not of passion or zeal, for God's word or to prevent God's word from being diffused, but rather the thing that burns you up inside as a result of sexual passion that steers you away from what ought to be the course of your life. Couldn't be simple. The impulse of a burning heart that cannot be quenched. You're simply consumed with passion for this woman. Needless to say, a woman's passions, a woman's emotions don't figure at all, not the least little bit, into the thinking of these male German pietists. So you'll have to substitute if you care to. Zeu kashem mikulam. This is the hardest of all. You can't think of anything but this woman who a passion for her is absolutely consuming you. And sometimes, and this takes us right back into the world of the 12th, 13th century, al yedei shafim. It's accomplished by means of witchcraft, even if he's never seen her. What the sages said, the evil impulse, only rules over what the eyes see, refers to the impulse of yearning for arousal of desire. And this reminds me of later thinkers who talk about how the thing that arouses the greatest passion sometimes is the thing that you can't see rather than the thing that you see right before your eyes. Like the notion of a beautifully clothed woman being more sensuous than a naked woman because of what you don't see and what you have to imagine. The fire in your imagination makes that increase in sensuality or sensuousness. Now he reaches a fever pitch. Yetzer shahalev boer achar isha below re'aya. The passion that you feel for a woman without being able to see her. Inyan zek adam hamishtagea. You all know the word mishuga. It's like you've gone nuts. You've lost your mind. Like a pregnant woman who yearns to eat something day and night, ruminating about it and forgetting everything else on account of it. You know, the proverbial pregnant woman who wants nothing but ice cream or pickles, hopefully not at the same time, but ice cream or pickles, and is so obsessed about it that she can't go about her ordinary business. That is how kach ze hadavar kol hayom b'toch libo. So his heart is simply consumed with this passion that won't let go of him, that he can't exorcise, and that is essentially a matter of sexual lust. So there's a complete transformation. I hope you enjoyed the transition from Charles Blow's burning bones as he engages in this brief affair with the woman Evelyn, and this obsession with sexuality and sexual passion that we find on the part of the pietists. And that's not a metaphor. They're really talking about boys and men being diverted from what's supposed to be their true course. And there's more than a hint of influence from monasticism in this, rather than worldliness. And there is always in the Jewish tradition in the Middle Ages a kind of tension between the retreat from everyday affairs that include family matters and sexuality, and the usual combination that one should not be out of this world, one should be of this world. So the way around that is to take sexual passion and allegorize it, so that the sexual passion becomes passion for God instead of passion for a woman. And so we have Moses Alshich, the most popular preacher, trained in Salonika, and then he made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael and was among the great preachers and mystics in Sfat. Moshe Alshich's commentary on Song of Songs, and this beautiful verse right at the beginning, let him give me of the kisses of his mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine. Well, the sexual passion that's embodied in that verse should be perfectly obvious, but let's look at Alshich's commentary, which thoroughly spiritualizes it. With this, Solomon, the putative author of Song of Songs, begins to reveal the yearning of God's people in this miserable exile to cleave to God. So the object of sexual passion is not that of a man for a woman, whether he can see the woman or not, but of the bride Israel for the abandoning husband who is God. It's just look how beautifully Alshich puts this. It's no surprise how popular he was with his sermons being published and commentaries being published in the 16th century and then remaining continuously in print to the present day. So it's the desire of, in this miserable exile, lehidabek bo yitbarach, to cleave to God. The yam shilem, there's that key word mashal, which is a parable or a metaphorical, imagistic statement. Ka'amur v'chala na'a v'chasuda ahuvat melech asher shlachami beito v'yatza'a v'haita shama u'shmama kol hayom dava. So now the heartsick person is not the adolescent male who yearns for a woman that he can't see and can't have, but rather it's the desolate bride sent forth into exile, lovesick for her husband, recalling the champion of her youth, the love of her espousal. This is the raging fire, the passion that is simultaneously sexual and spiritual, which is the incredible genius of Song of Songs itself, that it can be taken literally as expressing the passion of men and women for one another in literal terms, but also in spiritual terms. She thought, I will speak that I may find relief. I will open my lips and respond. She's just like Job feeling abandoned by God. Perhaps God will notice me and his affection will be aroused by the sound of my pleas. She responded with a broken heart, a burnt body, an embittered spirit, like a tempest-tossed victim. Let him give me of the kisses of his mouth, kasher hayabi mekedem, as in the olden days. So this little excursion into sexuality that brought us at least into brief contact with Charles Blow's memoir has taken us a long way, from male-centeredness to female-centeredness, from the sexual passion of an adolescent male to the passion of the people Israel figured as the bride of the divine, yearning once again to feel that passion of relationship with God. I think this is a good time to stop for questions and comments. Rabbi Andelman?
Great. So I'm going to send to you in the chat the elaboration from the person who asked about the verbs earlier.
Okay, wait. So now I have to get the chat. Hold on. I see it. Okay. Go ahead.
Do you see it?
Oh, yes. The seduction. Obviously, I see. I just wasn't getting what the people were. Yes, in fact, I'm the one who translated that word seduced precisely in order to emphasize the language that our correspondent is talking about, which is the seduction that's used in connection with the woman violated, because Jeremiah is surely violated by this commission that has caused him such great suffering. Usual translations are something like enticed, but I don't think enticed carries as heavy a sexual load as seduced, which definitely resonates with the material, with the laws that your correspondent has referred to. So I'm sorry for blanking on that in the moment at first, and appreciate the clarification. And now I hope that we've gotten through the second part of the talk, that you can see how multivalent the imagery is and how it is also capable of gender switching, which you would not have been able to infer at all from the original Jeremiah quotation. So thank you for that.
So another comment on specifically this sexuality section is that without this passion, we wouldn't have procreation, and then there would be no one left to have passion for God, as this person put it. Right? Like there's a reason we have the sexual passion.
Well, that's really great, because another one of my talks, which I don't think I've given for community engagement, is about original sin in Jewish thought. And one of the things that always strikes me there is the way certain very prominent figures in the history of reception of the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, is that they seem to think that it would have been ideal if men and women could reproduce without passion. In other words, by simply controlling the members that are necessary for reproduction rationally, without succumbing to irrational passions, that would have been the original intention of God in placing the first man and woman into the garden, rather than our succumbing to these uncontrollable passions, as we do as a result of the fall. That's how it goes. And there's some pretty amusing accounts of this. For example, around the year 1300, in commenting on this dubious proposition, he says something like, if not for if not for the primordial sin in the garden, men and women would reproduce naturally like trees, which experience no passion when they yield fruit. I have two questions about that. First of all, how does he know what trees experience when they bear fruit? And the second thing is, and this gets back to the comment, what fun would that be? I mean, did God create humanity not to have fun? And of course, the constraints that are put on sexual activity represent a whole different matter when it comes to the history of culture and the history of society and so forth. So we're going to leave it at that. This bizarre notion that passionless reproduction is purely the product of a kind of rational control over the what eventually becomes uncontrollable passion would have been the original intent. This is in Augustine's City of God, and I think that's probably the ultimate source for the later Jewish authors who must have come into contact with Christian ideas later on. Thanks for the question. It gave me a chance to talk about one of my favorite bizarre passages.
Well, I'm okay with my fourth grader having that understanding for the time being. So there are a lot of other comments going back to the first section before the sexuality piece. I don't know if you want to go back to that now, or if I should save them for later.
Let's save them for later so that I can make sure that I get to discuss the flip-flop, which is going to happen now. I'm pretty sure there will be time.
Great.
I think probably most people have heard of Nachman of Brazlov, one of the most influential of the Hasidic masters. You can see his dates, 1772 to 1810. And there's this tremendous collection of the Brazlovers' teachings in a collection called Likutei Moharan, which just means the gleanings of Rabbi Nachman. And I believe that the first volume from which this excerpt is drawn, there's no question about its authenticity, because I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, that it was first published while the Bratslav was still alive, sometime around 1808. You could check that. And if you're interested in reading this stuff, then there's a very readable translation on Safaria. So I've given you links there so you can find them if you have the electronic copy of our book. So he has this long lesson here in Book 1, Chapter 78, about the presence and the Holy Spirit and the need to apply oneself wholeheartedly to Torah. Godel ma'alat asek ba'Torah. Remember, we began with a bracha, la'asok b'divrei Torah, this immersion in Torah, applying oneself to the Holy Torah, which is the essence of a person's life. And here he draws on more Zoharic imagery about the relationship between the capacity to study and the parts of the body. If not for the lobes of the lungs fanning the heart would consume the entire body. That's such an elusive and wonderful phrase, but we'll get some clarification of what it means as we progress in this particular section of the Bratslaver. The lungs are the aspect of Torah, as explained above. Obviously, I didn't reproduce that portion for you. A person has two conflagrations burning inside him. One is positive, the other is not. Neither is beneficial, which I kind of like, because that brings us back to Jeremiah in the sense that having this being burning up all the time, whether it's for a good purpose or a bad purpose, is not necessarily the best thing, right? And one might think about the notion, the Aristotelian notion that's so prominent in Maimonides' thinking, about how it's best to steer the middle course and not to go to one extreme or another. And if you think of the old humors, not to be too hot, not to be too cold, not to be too wet, not to be too dry. You want to steer the middle course in between the extremes. There are times when the heart of a Jew, lefamim lev ha'ish ha'yisraeli, bo'er me'od me'od l'Hashem yitbarach kikad yikod eish. And there's that imagery of the burning heart straight out of Jeremiah, like a blazing conflagration. Excessive could consume him completely. That's Jeremiah. That's Jeremiah's dilemma. Although his fiery passion is for God, since it is in excess, it's not beneficial. You can't cool it. You can't reduce the flame. It's a trivial analogy, but it's like the difference between a controlled burn and one of the wildfires we've been experienced. The thing about controlled burn is that it just takes a matter of seconds for what you thought was controlled to go wildly out of control and cause terrible destruction. And that's the kind of image that I'm thinking of when I read the Bratslaver here. It's impossible. Efshar likarer u'tzamtzem hahit lahavut hazot. You cannot cool off, you can't control or reduce this incredible conflagration, reduce the flame so that it is within measure except through the Torah. So the flaming yearning for God's presence can be kept in check by immersion in Torah study. And that's what he means by the cooling influence of the lungs, which is Torah study, keeping the flame that's within the heart under some sort of control. So when you engage wholeheartedly in Torah study, and here's our verb again, ya'asok ba'Torah, then the Torah protects and saves him, reducing this fiery passion to a proper level. Appropriate, proper. The worst, God forbid, is likewise so. There are times when a person burns with such great desire for the temptations of this world, ta'avot olam, that word ta'ava, temptation, or temptation is good, or yearning, which we already saw in Sefer Hasidim as one of the terms that's used for sexual desire. If you burn for desire for things in the material world, with this too could consume the entire body. Chas v'shalom, God forbid. When you study Torah, it protects you, saves you from the flame of evil fire. So Torah study is the kind of Aristotelian mean, in a kind of peculiar sense, between yearning for the burning, living presence of God that would consume you whole on the one hand, and succumbing to the temptations of the material of the world on the other. Immersion in Torah study is the middle course between the two extremes of being, as it were, overly spiritual, being burned up by that, and being overly material with the concerns of this world. So that's the boon that Torah study grants to us as Jews to enable us to steer our way through life. And finally, this passage from Sichota Moharan. This is a remarkable document that was collections of the table talk of the Bratslaver by his leading disciple, who was a man named Nathan Sternhardt. You can see his date, 1780 to 1844. And it reminds us of a great tradition of the medieval period, but also even going back into late antiquity, of gleanings from the table of the great sages, right? So it's not just the Sforim, the books that they wrote. It's not just the homilies and interpretations and philosophical speculations and poems and so forth that they left for us, but also the incredible amount that you can learn just from their everyday table talk. And we can see this surviving in the Hasidic world to this day, so that the Rebbe of a particular Hasidic group may well deliver extemporaneous words of Torah at, for example, a Shabbat afternoon tish, a Shabbat afternoon meal that's filled with study and filled with singing, and that precedes the evening service or the afternoon service. And I've read about disciples of these Rebbes with extraordinary memories who are able then to set them down in writing as soon as the Sabbath is over. Because of course you're not allowed to put this stuff in writing during the Shabbos, but you can do so afterwards. So you get people with extraordinary memories to recall what the Rebbe said, and then these are published in large compilations of usually verifiable authenticity because of the number of witnesses who actually heard the talk. So here's some table talk from the Bratslaver. He asked me innocently, have you heard words of Musar from me? Now, Musar is a very malleable term. Its core meaning has something to do with disciplining or reproof. But I would say this is more like advice for living, right? How to conduct a good life, how to conduct one properly. Nowadays, we would say, this is the advice you get from a life coach. Well, I'm supposed to steer you on the true path in your life. So, have you heard words of life coaching from me? He said he couldn't speak words of life coaching because every word of his was dipped and washed in tears. For that reason, he couldn't say Musar explicitly. But wait a minute, says Nathan of Brazlov, the disciple. We were pretty perplexed by his saying that there was no Musar in what he said, because in our opinion, all of his words were divrei Musar gadol me'od ke'esh bo'eret mamash. So all of his words were great words of Musar, of life coaching, life advice, directing us on the path towards good living, like a burning fire. He didn't preach like ordinary preachers. His discourse pertained only to service of God, avodat Hashem. V'chol dvarav hayu kegachale eish mamash. All his words were actually like fiery coals. Anyone who was worthy to hear a word from his mouth felt as if an actual burning fire had entered within him. Misha zacha l'shema dibur mipiv haya nichnas b'kirbo ke'esh bo'eret mamash. And what I love about this is that it's actually, as I mentioned before briefly, a 180-degree reversal of Jeremiah, who wants to get the fire out. Now here's the yearning to be worthy enough to capture the fire within. With moderation, to be sure, if one follows the Likutei HaMoharan, but to have that spiritual force characterized as a fire within yourself. It's impossible to explain or represent. Yefshar liva'er, l'tzayer, lo b'chtav, lo b'feh, etzem tav erat kidushat diburav sheyatzeu mipiv hakadosh v'hanora b'kedusha u'v'tahara. Again, I mean, for the translator, this is just an insuperable problem because there's so much overload here, emphasizing the power of the fire and the saintliness and holiness of the speaker from whose source the fire comes. So I did my best. Incendiary holiness of the words that came from his holy mouth, awesome in holiness and purity. Every single word of his, even everyday discourse, right? You were taught as kids to avoid unnecessary sichat chulin, ordinary everyday discourse that's supposed to talking specifically about matters of Torah. Even his everyday discourse, illuminated and shone and inflamed like a burning fire. Me'ir, umazhir, umitlahev, ke'esh lohet, going back to that incredible verse in Song of Songs, which is the only possible mention of God in Song of Songs. Rishafeh harishpei eish shal hevet yah. Flashes of fire, a very flame, a divine flame, if you adopt the traditional interpretation of it. The usual interpretation by modern scholars is that it's not a divine flame, it's a fantastic flame, like a god-awful flame, you would say in English idiom, rather than literally from the divine. But traditional commentators see it as literally from the divine. So the inflaming word of God comes through God's earthly representative, Nachman of Brazlov, and is received as Jeremiah is compelled to receive the divine word within him to necessitate his prophetic discourse. But this is spiritual illumination, not something to be shunned, but something to be desired, unless you don't take the necessary steps to prevent yourself from being burned up by it. That kind of paradox is characteristic of Nachman's thought and also of Hasidic thought more generally. Whoever ma'azinu makshiv, whoever is paying close attention to his words, then be'emet u'v'tzmimut hayakol dibur v'dibur shalo poreach v'nechnas. I love the image of fire blossoming in one's soul. Kalabat eish mamash, like a real flame of fire. This fire, what's its effect on Jeremiah? It makes Jeremiah say, I don't want to say your name anymore. I don't want to know from God. But what does it make the disciple of Nachman say? To be drawn to God with wondrous attachment, with burning zeal for God, as if one were standing literally in God's awesome, holy splendor, with no choice but to do other than to act in accordance with God's will. Okay, there's no choice. Lo yalanu od shum bichira. The heart was exceedingly drawn. Halev haya nimshach me'od me'od l'Hashem yitbarach. So Nachman's words had the function of drawing the yearning for God deep into people's hearts, deep into their bones, even at risk of being burned alive. Such was their yearning for this kind of spiritual union with God that could be achieved by the means that we're discussing. Impossible to evaluate and measure. And finally, just to see some of this language brought forward, you can see once again, this is the conclusion of the Sichot, the conclusion of the conversation. That anybody who immerses themselves in the books of our holy and awesome teacher, engages on them in truth and integrity, will certainly have yit lahev libo me'od l'Hashem yitbarach. Will have their hearts inflamed for God because his words are like fiery coals. And finally, from a sermon, it's great the way I talked about Sefer Hasidim. Well, that's from sometime in the 12th and 13th century. And here's this sermon that I can tell you was delivered on January 22nd of 1916. So wouldn't you love to be able to date all our ancient sources that way? And this comes from the Sochacha Rebbe, who died in 1926. And this is a sermon on Parashat Yidro, where he's going to use that same verse from Song of Songs that we just saw. Jews are kshurim b'kadosh baruch hu b'nefesh u'v'seichel, haino b'leiv u'v'moach. Remember that Zohar quotation at the very beginning of the class? I talked about the center of our beings being the heart, and the heart being connected to the mind. The idea is that being wholly with God is not just spiritual, not just in the heart. It's also in the mind too. In the heart, which is the yearning to shukah. There's another word for desire that could be applied to the material as well as to the spiritual. For their heavenly parent, as it is written, and here we have spelled out the beautiful verse from Song of Songs, Rishafeha Rishpe Eshal Havet Yah, the flashes of love are flashes of fire, a very flame of Adonai, encompassing all the virtues. In intellect, Hu HaSeichel HaYashar, Seichel HaTorah, the mind of Torah, the intellectual illumination and enlightenment that we get through the study of Torah. I don't think that HaSeichel HaYashar means what it means in modern Hebrew, which is sometimes common sense. In other words, the ordinary common sense that you would have just as a person with intelligence. I think it means the learning and the knowledge that's gained from Torah. And by both means, intellectually and spiritually, through the mind and the heart, one is drawn to God. The intellect in its own right, the heart in its own right, afilu b'li hora'at haseichel. Finally, we remember that this guy's a Hasidic Rebbe. So that ultimately the passion, the source, the love, the yearning for God comes not from the mind, but from the heart. Ideally complemented by that which is intellectual, but it comes straight from the heart. It's the burning heart. It's the passion, the fire in the bones, which is sexual and which is spiritual and which can cause us torment, but which also can cause us the greatest spiritual illumination. So I think that's a good place to stop for your questions and comments. Okay with you, Rabbi Andelman?
Absolutely. Okay,
And
so
I'm
I
going
want
to stop the share.
Okay. I'm going to share, I have sort of like a collection of larger themes, but I want to first share just a question specifically on the text you just went through with us. So someone asked, are these followers inflamed, finding merit in what is found in the words, or infusing them with what is not there, as people in love often do to the object of their affection, be it person or something else?
Well, that's a kind of it calls for a subjective judgment on my part, but I mean, my basic answer is yes. In other words, there's always an anchor in the text, but to use a metaphor that I like to use in connection with Rashi, as long as you're anchored in the text, then you can fly up into the stratosphere in a balloon that's tethered to the ground. And I think that's what most of our homiletical interpretation does. It might go way off into the stratosphere, but we still hope that it will retain its anchor in our sources and in our tradition. And I mean the text itself, and I mean the history of the reception of the text as well, so that the sources resonate with one another, and you are as responsible to prior commentary and prior interpretation and prior homily than as you are to whatever you have going on in your own imagination and heart. It's a great question. And what I like to do is I use Rashi as my model, because Rashi has a twofold method of interpretation in which he wants to know, first of all, what the text says, and then offers some suggestion mainly drawn from prior midrash, prior rabbinic commentary about what it means. And some of what Rashi derives from the previous commentary looks insanely far-fetched. But the more you give it thought, the more you can find that it is indeed anchored in the text. It can stray far from the text. It can, as I said, go off into the stratosphere. You can find it anchored in the text. And that's what I strive for. It's interesting to see what the Jeremiah text might have meant to the people who first heard it or the people who first read it. And I love to try to do that. But what's more pertinent, it seems to me, is to see how we can read through the history of the reception of the text in order to ascertain what it might mean to us today. And I love the push and pull of Jeremiah and his desire to rid himself of this burning passion, which he can't do, of course, and the disciples of Nachman, who yearn to have that fire instilled in them.
So I've been thinking throughout your session today about I heard a Dvar Torah on Hanukkah that that landed so wrong. You know, it's like it's dark, like the lights are sort of lifting our spirits, and someone gave this Dvar Torah about, you know, don't forget there's also fire that's bad. Let's think about that too. I was thinking, what's the value of that? But what I'm really taking away from what you're teaching now, and especially the Rabbi Nachman text, is I think the controlled burn is a great example. It's not just that there's good fire and bad fire. The same fire can be good or bad, right? A brush fire can be one that's, you know, that goes wild and consumes things that shouldn't be consumed, or one that's set on purpose to make things work. And so I think that's a great metaphor for what he's talking about in terms of channeling passion for God into Torah study. And it made me think about, I mean, Torah study, which we obviously want to elevate, and also other kinds of containers for passion and emotion, like, you know, film and music and painting and theater that sometimes are hard to process if they're just sort of loose, whereas the art creates a container for it where we can sort of work through it. And also it's a place to contain it in the sense of you go visit it, you sort of listen to that music or see that art, and then you leave and go back to something else, and you're not dwelling in that space all the time. So maybe that's also right why it's not consuming, because it's sort of contained to particular activities or particular works. Do you think that's a decent read of what you've been sharing?
Well, I love what you just said about passion controlled is more powerful than passion randomly unleashed. I'm always reminded of Tchaikovsky's famous characterization of Mozart as the most sensuous composer. That's a kind of a head scratcher, right? Except because Mozart is working within established classical forms, constraining outbursts of passion in a manner that Tchaikovsky himself often didn't do. And it's the combination between the sensuousness and eroticism of the music and of the characters in his operas, coupled with the classical restraint that's imposed by the musical form. You might say the same thing about a sonnet, about Shakespeare's sonnets, which are so incredibly filled with passion and eroticism, and yet which are contained within the form. Or the biblical Book of Lamentations, particularly the first couple of chapters, which show these incredible constraints of inform, to some extent meter, the acrostic form of the opening chapters, the symmetrical construction that shows repetition of key words in a symmetrical way. It's a way of constraining the passion so that you move from what would have been the natural response to the destruction of the temple and the exile of the people, which would have been to scream and cry and, and be inarticulate, to finally, after some time has passed, the formation of this incredibly powerful and passionate and yet beautifully constrained poetry. So that I think that's So I hope those analogies work for some of you, to see what we're talking about. That passion contained in some way is more powerful than passion simply unleashed in a kind of random scattershot way. It can be destructive, but the kind of passion I'm talking about is constructive.
So just to come full circle to some of the themes that you raised at the beginning that there were a lot of comments about. So it seems like for Jeremiah and for Jonah, for example, for Moses at the beginning, this right, the fire of prophecy is not something they feel they can contain, or sort of the vehicle of prophesying sort of doesn't cut it for them. And then people also were raising, but someone raised John Lewis, which I loved, right? Just the good trouble, or people who kind of channel their passion into starting movements. So it seems like, right, we really have both. We have people who are sort of lit up by the truth and find it unbearable, like Jeremiah, and people who really turn it into something in the world. So I don't know, how does one why can, I know you're not a psychologist, but why can some people handle it and others not? Or sort of what's the message for us? Is there some strategy for knowing how to channel the passion versus being consumed by it?
It's a great question. I mean, if I could answer it, I would bottle and patent the answer and make $1 zillion. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are trying to do this, with their various kinds of life coaching and career advice and attempts to organize. And the only thing, no, I'm not going to try to. I'm not going to try to answer off the top of my head. But I don't subscribe to the Nike point of view. Just do it, because that doesn't turn out to be very effective in most cases. But I remember, you'll all remember probably the way Jimmy Carter was always accused of not being able to do anything because he thought everything to death. Right? And in academia, the usual response to a thorny problem is, we better form a committee. And you probably find some of that in your own lines of work or in your own lives. And I mean, right now, there are lots of committees talking about the Ukraine. On the other hand, I'm not saying we ought to just do it, whatever it is. So it's the rock and hard place that Rabbi Endelman just described.
So it's sort of finding the balance of to put it in a mundane way, process and products, but more importantly, kind of the maybe it's passion and passion, being consumed, being inspired, sort of the passion and the where you go with it, feeling it and doing something with it. So I did not know where you were going to go today at all. I didn't look at the source in advance. I was very intrigued by the title, and I feel like I learned so much today, and I'm sure everyone does. This, just going into this one metaphor, I think we learned each of the texts you presented. I think we have a much clearer understanding of it, and just in the bringing them all together, kind of thinking of fire as as something that can end you or that can send you somewhere. I think is just very powerful and inspiring. So thank you so much for teaching us today.
Thanks for your really helpful clarifications and comments, Rabbi Endelman. They've been helping me keep my thoughts organized, which I'm not always real good at.
I want to thank everyone for coming as well, and thank Yale Aspel for sponsoring. I would guess that he will either listen or watch the recording, and invite everyone to join us right here next week. We have Professor Eitan Fishbane teaching about compassion and love in Jewish mystical sources. So maybe today was a little bit of a jumping off point for that. So thank you everyone again. Thank you, Professor Cooper. It's a pleasure to learn with you, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thanks.